The body in Chadian custody wasn't supposed to become headline news. The activist's death was meant to stay quiet, buried in paperwork, lost in the chaos of a collapsing region. But when Burkina Faso found out, everything exploded. What had been whispered tensions between two former allies became a public war of accusations, rage, and broken trust. And in December 2025, with militants watching and the Sahel burning, Chad and Burkina Faso sat down, not to reconcile, but to survive. This is the story of how silence became violence, and how two nations chose negotiation over annihilation. The cameras weren't rolling when Chad's delegation crossed into Ouagadougou in December 2025, but make no mistake, this wasn't a reunion. This was survival dressed up as diplomacy. Chad didn't come to heal old wounds or toast to brotherhood. They came because the fire next door was getting too close. And when your neighbor's house is burning, you don't ask if they still like you, you grab a bucket. This wasn't reconciliation. It was damage control. For months, the Sahel had been unraveling at the seams. Militant groups were no longer just probing borders. They were erasing them. Villages that once sat quiet under the sun now flickered with gunfire at night. Chad's military, battle-hardened and stretched thin, had been holding the line. But holding the line only works if the line stays still. Burkina Faso's chaos was bleeding over, and N'Djamena knew it. So they did what any nation on the edge does when ideology won't save you. They got practical. There were no grand speeches about unity. No flowery declarations of Sahelian solidarity. Just cold, clear-eyed calculus. Chad needed Burkina Faso stable. Or at least stable enough to stop becoming a highway for armed convoys and a breeding ground for the kind of violence that doesn't respect flags. The talks weren't about trust. They were about containment. And in a region where mistrust runs as deep as the desert sand, that's as close to honesty as diplomacy gets. Because here's what no one wants to say out loud. Chad and Burkina Faso don't have to like each other. They just have to not destroy each other. And right now, destruction was the default setting. Burkina Faso's military government, embattled and isolated, was fighting wars on multiple fronts. Jihadist insurgencies, internal dissent, and the ghosts of coups past. Chad, meanwhile, was juggling its own demons, a restless population, a volatile transition, and the creeping realization that regional collapse doesn't ask permission before it crosses your border. So Chad extended a hand, not in friendship, but in function. They didn't ask Burkina Faso to forgive past slights or forget old betrayals. They asked them to coordinate, to share intel, to stop the hemorrhaging before both nations bled out. It was transactional, sure, but in a region where survival is the only ideology left standing, transactions are what keep the lights on. Is this the new face of Sahelian diplomacy? Cold pragmatism over hollow promises? Drop your take, because what comes next gets even messier. The meetings were tense. Sources close to the talks described an atmosphere less like negotiation and more like a stalemate with words. Chad's officials didn't pretend they were there to rebuild bridges. They laid out the stakes plainly. Spillover violence was a mutual threat, and neither side could afford to let pride override reality. Burkina Faso listened, not because they trusted Chad, but because they had no better options. When your back's against the wall, even a lukewarm ally looks like a lifeline. And that's the brutal truth of December 2025. This wasn't diplomacy as we've known it. This was triage. Chad didn't care if Burkina Faso's government liked them. They cared if Burkina Faso's government could hold its territory long enough to stop the contagion from spreading. It wasn't personal. It was geographic. It was existential. The world will call it pragmatism. Others will call it cynicism. But in a region where hope has been rationed like water in a drought, maybe pragmatism is the only thing left worth trading. Chad came for stability, not solidarity. They came because the alternative, watching the region implode while sitting on the sidelines, was no longer an option. This wasn't a handshake. It was a fire break. And whether holds depends entirely on whether both sides can swallow their pride long enough to survive what's coming. Because in the Sahel, the fire doesn't negotiate. It just burns. They didn't just drift apart, they chose different wars. And by 2022, that choice had turned the border between Chad and Burkina Faso into a ghost zone, a no-man's land where neither flag flew, and only the armed and the desperate dared to move. This wasn't a breakdown in communication. This was a fracture in philosophy, and the cracks were filled with blood. Burkina Faso looked inward. After years of watching foreign allies make promises they couldn't keep and regional frameworks crumble under pressure, Ouagadougou made a call. We fight alone, or we don't fight at all. Autonomy became the doctrine. Direct control became the religion. No more joint operations with neighbors who might hesitate when it mattered. No more intelligence shared with capitals that leaked like sieves. Burkina Faso's military leadership decided that if survival meant cutting ties, then so be it. They pulled back. They fortified. They stopped answering the phone. Chad, meanwhile, stayed plugged in. N'Djamena had always played the long game, working within regional security frameworks, coordinating with allies, and leveraging institutional partnerships to keep the Sahel from imploding completely. They believed in the system, or at least in the idea that a broken system was better than no system at all. So while Burkina Faso turned inward, Chad kept showing up to the meetings, kept sharing intel, kept trying to hold the line through cooperation. But here's the problem. When one side stops cooperating, the whole machine breaks down. By late 2022, the joint border patrols that once kept militants guessing had vanished. The intelligence pipelines that used to hum with real-time updates went silent. The coordination that once allowed Chad and Burkina Faso to move as one against shared threats, gone. And in the space where that cooperation used to be, something far more dangerous took root. Nothing. Gray zones. Unmonitored stretches of land where no one was watching and everyone knew it. Armed groups didn't need an invitation, they just walked in. Smugglers, jihadists, mercenaries, anyone with a gun and a grudge found refuge in the gaps between two nations that couldn't agree on how to fight the same enemy. The border became a highway for violence, and neither side could do anything about it because neither side was talking. Is this the cost of sovereignty or the price of stubbornness? You tell me, because the consequences are about to get a whole lot messier. The divergence wasn't just tactical, it was ideological. Burkina Faso's strategy was rooted in distrust. Distrust of foreign powers, distrust of regional bodies, distrust of anyone who wasn't holding a rifle in Ouagadougou's name. They'd seen too many betrayals, too many half-hearted partnerships that evaporated the moment things got hot. So they built walls, figurative and literal, and decided that if they were going to fail, they'd fail on their own terms. Chad's approach was rooted in something else, realism. They knew the Sahel was too interconnected, too volatile, for any one nation to handle alone. They'd fought enough wars to understand that the enemy didn't respect borders. So why should the defense? For N'Djamena, cooperation wasn't idealism, it was survival. But cooperation takes two, and by 2022, Burkina Faso had stopped showing up. The result? Chaos with a map. The gray zones expanded. Villages that once saw patrols now saw nothing but dust until the convoys rolled through. And by then it was too late. Armed groups didn't just exploit the gaps, they thrived in them. They set up camps, recruited locals, and moved weapons and fighters with impunity. The border wasn't a barrier anymore. It was an opportunity. And the bitter irony? Both nations were losing the same war, just in different ways. Burkina Faso's isolation made them vulnerable to internal collapse. Chad's cooperation left them exposed to partners who couldn't or wouldn't pull their weight. Neither strategy was winning. Both were bleeding. What no one expected was that the breakdown wouldn't just hurt Chad and Burkina Faso. It would reshape the entire security architecture of the Sahel. Because when two nations stop working together, the void doesn't stay empty. Someone else fills it. And in 2022, that someone else wasn't wearing a uniform anyone recognized. This wasn't just a policy shift. It was a turning point. The moment the Sahel stopped fighting as a region and started fighting as a collection of isolated, desperate states. And the militants? They were watching. They were learning. And they were winning. The body told the story no diplomat wanted to speak out loud. When news broke that a Burkinabe activist had died in Chadian custody, the quiet fracture between two nations exploded into a public reckoning. This wasn't a policy disagreement anymore. This wasn't about divergent strategies or unmonitored borders. This was blood. This was betrayal. And this was the moment the Sahel realized that the silence between Chad and Burkina Faso had been hiding something far more dangerous than anyone admitted. For months, the tension had simmered beneath the surface. Two neighbors, once allies in the fight against regional collapse, had been drifting apart in ways that mattered but didn't make headlines. Chad kept working within frameworks. Burkina Faso kept building walls. The gap between them widened, but it stayed quiet, structural, technical. The kind of breakdown that gets discussed in closed-door meetings and then buried in reports no one reads. Until it couldn't be buried anymore. The activist's death ripped the veil off. Suddenly, what had been a slow-motion divorce became a public accusation. Burkina Faso's government didn't just demand answers, they demanded accountability. How does a citizen end up dead in a neighbor's custody? What was he doing there? What were the Chadians hiding? And why, if the two nations were supposed to be partners in security, did no one know this was happening until it was too late? Chad, caught off guard by the fury, scrambled to respond. Official statements were carefully worded, defensive, vague. An investigation was promised. Condolences were offered. But none of it landed. Because by then, the narrative had already shifted. In Ouagadougou, the activist wasn't just a casualty of circumstance. He was a symbol. A symbol of what happens when trust erodes. A symbol of what happens when cooperation dies and suspicion takes its place. Is this the breaking point or just the beginning of something even messier? Drop your take, because the fallout is about to reshape everything. The streets of Burkina Faso's capital felt the shock first. Protesters gathered, not in the thousands, but in the fury of the moment, demanding answers and justice. The government, already embattled and paranoid, seized the opportunity. This wasn't just about one activist. This was proof that Chad couldn't be trusted, proof that going it alone had been the right call all along, proof that every instinct to pull inward and fortify had been justified. The death became a rallying cry, and the wedge between the two nations drove deeper. Chad, meanwhile, found itself in an impossible position. Deny too much and you look guilty. Admit too much and you validate every accusation. So they did what states do when caught in the crossfire of public rage and diplomatic necessity. They tried to manage it. Quietly, carefully. But management doesn't work when the other side has already decided you're the villain. And here's the brutal truth that no one wanted to say out loud. The lack of coordination between Chad and Burkina Faso didn't just create gray zones for militants. It created gray zones for accountability. When two nations stop talking, when intelligence stops flowing, when patrols disappear and trust evaporates, people fall through the cracks. And sometimes those people don't come back. The activist's death wasn't an anomaly. It was a consequence of two nations that had stopped seeing each other as partners and started seeing each other as potential threats. A consequence of borders that were no longer patrolled together, of information that was no longer shared, of a relationship that had calcified into mutual suspicion. And now that suspicion had a face, a name, a body. What no one expected was how quickly the narrative would spiral. Within days, the story wasn't just about Chad and Burkina Faso anymore. It became a referendum on regional cooperation itself. If two neighbors who once fought side by side couldn't even protect each other's citizens, what hope was there for the Sahel? If trust could collapse this completely, this publicly, what did that say about every other alliance, every other framework, every other promise of solidarity? The death didn't just expose the hidden tensions, it weaponized them. Burkina Faso's government used it to justify their isolation. Chad's leadership used it to argue for more oversight, more transparency, more coordination. But both sides knew the damage was done. The activist's death had proven what many had feared, but few had dared to articulate. The lack of coordination carried real, visible human costs. And those costs were no longer theoretical. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a turning point. The moment the Sahel's quiet fractures became impossible to ignore. And the question now wasn't whether Chad and Burkina Faso could rebuild trust. It was whether they even wanted to try. December 2025 wasn't about reconciliation. It was about recognizing that the alternative to talking was watching everything burn. When Chad reached out to Burkina Faso that month, it wasn't with open arms or grand declarations of unity. It was with a cold, hard calculation. If we don't manage this, no one will. And in a region where collapse spreads like wildfire, management isn't idealism, it's survival. For years, silence had been the strategy. Distance had been the default. After the breakdown in cooperation, after the public accusations and the death that turned hidden tensions into front-page rage, both nations had retreated into their corners. Chad kept working its regional networks. Burkina Faso kept fortifying its autonomy. And between them, the void grew. But silence, it turned out, wasn't reducing the risks. It was multiplying them. Armed groups thrived in the gray zones. Militants moved freely where patrols had once coordinated. Villages burned while two governments pretended the other didn't exist. By the end of 2024, the cost of distance had become impossible to ignore. So they made a choice. Not to trust, not to forgive, but to negotiate. Chad's December outreach wasn't a peace offering. It was a business proposal. A recognition that the differences between the two nations, the ideological divides, the strategic divergences, weren't going to disappear. But they didn't have to. Because what both sides finally understood was that you don't need to agree on everything to agree on the one thing that matters. Neither of us can afford total collapse. And right now, that's exactly where we're headed. Is this pragmatism or resignation? Drop your take. Because what comes next is a blueprint for survival in a region that's running out of options. The talks were nothing like the diplomacy of old. There were no flowery speeches about Sahelian brotherhood, no nostalgic references to shared history or common destiny. Just two governments, exhausted and stretched thin, sitting across from each other and laying out the terms of coexistence. Burkina Faso wasn't going to abandon its autonomy-first strategy. Chad wasn't going to stop working within regional frameworks. Fine. The question wasn't whether they'd align. It was whether they could tolerate each other's divergence long enough to stabilize the border. And that's what made December 2025 historic. Not because it healed anything, but because it acknowledged that healing wasn't the point. Stability was. Managed, negotiated, transactional stability. The kind that doesn't rely on goodwill or shared values, but on mutual recognition of consequences. You do your thing, we'll do ours. But let's at least make sure the militants don't use the space between us as a playground. It was a new paradigm, and whether anyone wanted to admit it or not, it was the only paradigm left standing. West Africa's old security architecture, the one built on assumptions of cooperation, trust, and collective action, had crumbled. What replaced it wasn't chaos, but something colder. A system where stability isn't assumed, it's actively negotiated. Every time, every border, every threat. Chad came for managed coexistence, not reconciliation. Burkina Faso came because the alternative was worse. And in a region where worse is a very low bar, that was enough. Behind closed doors, the negotiations were tense but functional. Chad proposed limited intelligence sharing on specific threats. Burkina Faso countered with conditions around sovereignty and operational independence. Neither side gave much. Neither side expected to. But slowly, incrementally, they found a floor, a baseline, just enough coordination to stop the bleeding without forcing either nation to compromise on what they'd already decided was non-negotiable. And here's what no one wants to say out loud. This might be the future. Not just for Chad and Burkina Faso, but for the entire Sahel. A future where alliances are temporary, cooperation is conditional, and stability is something you negotiate meeting by meeting, crisis by crisis. No grand coalitions, no permanent partnerships, just nations doing the bare minimum to keep the region from imploding while holding tight to whatever autonomy they have left. It's not inspiring, it's not hopeful, but it might be real. By the time the December meetings wrapped, neither side was celebrating. There were no press conferences boasting of breakthroughs. No joint statements promising a new era. Just quiet acknowledgement that the work had been done. The border would be managed. The gray zones would shrink, at least a little. The militants would find it harder to move freely, at least for now. It wasn't victory. It was damage control. And in the Sahel in 2025, damage control is the best anyone can hope for. This wasn't the turning point. It was the realization that there might not be one. That maybe, just maybe, the new normal is a region held together not by trust, but by necessity. And if that's what it takes to keep the Sahel from collapsing entirely, then so be it.